Hey, welcome to Mrs. G's Sewing Space. I'm going to make this short and quick. We are doing a skirt alteration, so I'm going to get to my voiceover because I haven't recorded it yet. And I hope you guys enjoy the video. It was a real simple alteration. I'm going to do my best to explain what I did so that you guys can see how I took a waistband that was 5 inches too big for my daughter and got it to fit her just right. So I'm going to get on to the video, and as always, if you guys enjoy this video, give me a thumbs up, hit the like button, subscribe. All those things help me and promote my video, and I appreciate it. And now we'll get to the video. So here's the skirt. It was quite big on my daughter. I'd already marked a 5 inch gap on the waistband so that I can know where I needed to take what in. And this is just to show you that it was actually 5 inches. We picked this up at a thrift store. She really liked it, but it was too big. So here I am using my hip curve, which is another ruler, just to show you that the back seam is not straight. There's a curve to it, so I have to take that into account when I draw out my new back seam. I also decided to take in about 2 inches on that back seam at the bottom so that the skirt won't be so wide at the bottom. I'm using my hip curve here and a water-soluble pencil to make my markings. And you can see some other lines there that I was playing around with earlier to see where I wanted that line and if I did want to take in so much and from what point, and fooling around with the bottom of the skirt. So as you can see, I laid it flat with the side seams matching and my marks on the waistband matching and pinned together so that I can make my mark. All I need to do is make a mark on one side. And now that I know where I'm going to cut, it's time to unpick. I'm not going to just cut it off. I'm going to unpick that back seam and the waistband so that I can then make a more appropriate alteration. So I'm looking here, I need to unpick my pockets, I need to unpick that belt loop, and I need to unpick the waistband as well as that center back seam. As you can see, I moved to a box cutter, which is what I use to also unpick seams. If I can hold the fabric tight, and that way I can just cut through the seams, and it'd be super simple just doing that. And you just got to be careful not to poke holes in the fabric with either the seam ripper or the box cutter. Sometimes you just gotta use the seam ripper, and sometimes you can use the box cutter. There we go, using the box cutter. So I'm holding each side of the fabric tight so I can see the threads and just lightly move my box cutter against those threads. And it's a sharp blade, so it makes it super simple. And you can see I'm using my elbows to hold the fabric down. My arms are holding the fabric down to pull everything tight. Okay, now that we have that done, I'm saving my pockets because I am going to stitch them back on later, so we'll just set those aside with the belt loop. And I'm going to go ahead and cut where I need to cut. So I unpicked that hem so I wouldn't have to sew through multiple layers of fabric, as in like 6 layers on top of 6 layers. I unpicked that hem so that when I sewed everything back together, it would be a normal like 3 layers on that hem instead of 6. And right there I cut through the waistband. So I cut off the excess fabric and then I just cut through the waistband. Just cut it right in half. And now I'm going to line up the side seams, matching everything up as I go, right sides together. And then I'm going to cut off the excess on the other side of the skirt. Being careful not to go through any other layers of fabric. I just want those 2 back panels done. Okay, so now I'm going to trim the waistband, but first I'm going to unpick everything else on the waistband. So anytime there's top stitching or a seam or anything that needs to be picked out, you need to pick out everything. So I'm taking the back center seam now, my new seam, which is what I just cut off, and I'm going to go ahead and pin that in place. And I'm lining up the bottom edge of the hem so that those marks will match all the way around, because I don't want this alteration to look like there's been an alteration made. So I'm trying to get everything to match up like it was prior. Okay, here's the waistband again. I'm making sure that the right sides are together so that when I sew the waistband, the seam on the inside, when you flip it right sides out, that it actually lays like it's supposed to. So I'm putting my pins in, and as you can see I have a little excess right there, and I'm going to take my scissors and cut that little bit off because I didn't cut it straight enough. Okay, so now I've got my waistband pinned together. And then there's the back center seam, and I'm going to sew there. Alright, so here we go. I sewed the seam on my sewing machine, and then I went back and serged over the edge because denim will ravel. I did not do the waistband because it's going to be tucked to the inside, so I don't have to worry about that. But where your butt's going to be rubbing against the seam, you need to serge because that denim will ravel. Now on the prior skirt, they top stitched that center back seam, and I'm going to do the same thing. So there is my seam allowance, and I'm going to stitch my seam allowance down on that center back seam. And this is the thread that I purchased just for this. It matches the copper thread on the skirt. One's a thicker thread and one is a thinner thread. I decided to use the thinner thread in my bobbin and the thicker thread on the top, so I'll be top stitching all this down. I kind of figured it would be better for my sewing machine to have a thinner and a thicker thread working together instead of 2 thick threads working together. Now the needle that I had in was kind of small, but I went with it anyways because I didn't want to change needles. It takes too much time. I mean, it doesn't take that much time, but I just got lazy. And you can see how it bites me in the butt later. Okay, so now I am stitching down right against the center seam so that the seam allowance will be stitched down. And I'm kind of forcing the fabric through my machine. I'm letting the machine pick up the fabric and go, but I'm also kind of pushing it in as well. I didn't want any knots or problems, or I didn't want my machine to chew up the fabric either, so I just kind of, not forcefully, but guided it with a little oomph, I guess. Not too much though, because I didn't want wrinkling either. I'm constantly adjusting the fabric so that any other part of the skirt doesn't get caught up underneath and I'm accidentally sewing down the front of the skirt to the back of the skirt. At this point, I realized I should have used a bigger needle and the thread is just too big for my smaller needle. So I had to change out needles anyways, which I should have done in the first place. And I ended up moving to a size 16, which is meant for denim and heavier fabrics. It also has a larger eye in the needle for my thicker thread. So despite years of sewing experience, I still get lazy and I'm like, now I gotta go back and pick everything. Or maybe not. I don't remember what I did. I guess I didn't unpick. Oh, I just kept going. Okay. Well, it's good to know. I just kept going. Okay, and there we go. So we're done with that seam. Everything looked alright. I clipped all my loose threads. So see, there you go. Alright, it looks pretty decent. It's not the same thread as that the manufacturer sewed with, but it was the closest thing I could find at Joann's. So now I'm starting at the bottom, doing the same thing. And I thought I was sewing at a good amount of space between the two seam lines. So I'm double checking to see what it looks like. And I'm finding that they're too far apart. So it looks good there, but it's actually too far apart because I want to sew down that seam allowance. So I didn't catch the seam allowance, so I have to unpick and resew that line. So thankfully I didn't sew the entire thing right there. Otherwise I'd have to repick the entire thing and that would stink. Alright, whew, that was painful. Sometimes you have to unpick entire seams and that's just a pain in the rear end. But sometimes when you sew, that's what happens. Okay, so here we go. I'm sewing the seam again, but I'm taking I think it was about 1/4 of an inch, maybe just over 1/4 of an inch, to make sure that I got the seam allowance to sew flat. So I put my needle in. Whenever I am adjusting the fabric, I always put my needle in the fabric so it doesn't lose its spot. so always making sure there's nothing caught up underneath, and we just keep moving forward. So I'm doing a slight tug at the back. My machine just, I don't know if it was my machine or me. I think it was my machine. It just wasn't particularly happy sewing through denim. So I'm trying not to pull too much, but it's just a little bit of pressure to get that seam line done. I'm taking my time over the humps and anywhere that might give me problems. Okay, so there we go, snip. Okay, so there we go. So that's much better looking, and the seam allowance is sewn down, just like it was in the original skirt. And that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to copy the original skirt. So now it's time to hem, because that's what time it is. So just make sure you pick out any loose threads, because I'm trying to follow the original seam lines. So when I line it up, do a couple of inches on the original seam line, and then I just follow along, and I try to match the seam lines on the original skirt as much as I can. I was having problems here for some reason. I can't remember why, but my machine was not happy with me. So, and I missed a spot, so I have to go back and pick out again. Okay, so I finally got it done. I got my machine to work, and we finally finished that up. So I started there at the bottom. I sewed the hemline, and that center back seam looks just like it did on the original. Awesome. Good job, Emily. So now we're going to reattach the waistband. And just so that you know, before you reattach this waistband, you need to also add in your belt loop, which I did not do. I did that later on. It would have been easier to add it now, but I got ahead of myself and I did not. So once again, I'm cleaning everything up. No loose threads anywhere that would get in the way or cause problems. So I'm sewing on the waistband the same way that the original manufacturer did. I do a stitch line there and a stitch line at the top so that everything matches. And I'm doing my best to stay on the original stitch line. You can always see the stitch lines from the manufacturer, and so I do my best to stay on those lines, because like I said before, I don't want people to think that I altered the skirt. There's some indications, like the pocket placement or the fact that the tag has been cut in half, but I try not to let people know that I've actually done an alteration. So this is called a seam jumper. So when you have layers of fabric, sometimes your sewing machine has a problem sewing over it. So you put this little thing in the back and it lifts your presser foot up so it's even with that top layer of your hump. Then that way you can sew over it without any problems. And then when it's over the hump, you see that the jump humper just falls to the side and you can continue sewing on. I don't claim to understand why it works that way. I just know it does. It took me forever to figure out what that was. I think I found out by accident. And never sew over your pins. And there is the waistband, or the waistband bottom. So now the waistband has been attached to the skirt. Snipping all the loose threads. And now we're going to go over the top. Doing my best to follow along with the original seam line. There's the hump jumper again. Okay, there you go, there's the top of the bottom. Alright, so this is the back of the skirt so far. Now we need to add our belt loop, and I'm like, oh crud. Double checking how the belt loop, there we go. At this point I realized I should have added a belt loop when sewing the waistband down and didn't, so I have to unpick and redo a small part of the waistband to slip in that belt loop. Because if you look at the other belt loops, they're sewn into the waistband before they're sewn flat. I just need to open up a space big enough to put the belt loop in and not the entire waistband this time. But if I had placed the belt loop where it was supposed to be when I sewed the waistband on in the first place, I wouldn't be going through this issue right now. Always get rid of those loose threads. They will turn around and bite you in the bum later on when you're sewing, because those loose threads can get caught up in your sewing machine and just cause problems. And now I am matching everything up along with the other belt loops so that it looks like it's supposed to be in place. And thankfully it goes in the center back so that you don't see that seam line in the waistband. So no one ever knows that that waistband was originally cut in two with the original alterations, because now it's hidden by the belt. Okay, so now that the waistband is done, it was time to put the pockets back on. I was able to put one pocket back into its original position, but as you can see, the pocket on the left has been shifted slightly to the left, so you can see the original seam lines there. But it still worked out. If you're not looking for those seam lines, they're hardly noticeable, and my daughter doesn't notice them at all, so she's like, whatever. And I'm cool with that, and she likes her skirt. I like her skirt. I'm glad she's able to wear it, and so she's happy with it despite those seam lines right there. And I don't think anybody said anything to her. Nobody said anything to me, so we're gonna roll with it. So once again, picking out all those loose threads that could complicate your life when they don't need to. And I'm gonna sew down the sides and the bottom and keep the back pocket open, so you can put stuff in it, like candy or your cell phone or whatever. Okay, you can see the hump jumper in this one. I needed it to start out on my pocket. I'm also making sure that none of the skirt gets caught up underneath the presser foot. And I'm just sewing back down. I'm either sewing on top of the stitching that's already there, or I'm stitching in the same seam line or stitching line that the original thread was in. So now for that particular pocket has now been stitched down, but now I'm going to go back and do the secondary stitching, that second line. You can tell there that I'm not quite on line. It looks a little thicker than prior, and that's just fine. Okay, now we're just doing some extra stitching at the top to make sure it stays all in one place. It's reinforcement stitching is what I'm doing at the top of the pocket. Alright, so here at the front I also did a extra stitching. I thought the split was a little too high for my daughter, so I just stitched over it You can tell where I stitched that. It's a copper rectangle right there, so I just stitched it shut so that she could still have the slit. It's just not as high as it was prior. And there we go. And that's the end. Oh, wait a minute, am I going out or in? Okay, here we go. So here's the entire back, totally stitched up, and I think it looks pretty decent. My thread isn't quite the same color as the manufacturer's thread, but there you go. I think it, to me, you can hardly tell. I mean, you can still see a little bit of my markings, but they just need to be washed out. There you go. And you can see the outline of that one pocket right there on the left. You can see where I shifted the pocket just a little bit, but that'll eventually fade in time and it will be hardly noticeable. Ooh, this alteration turned out so well. I was so happy with it. So proud. I'm so proud of myself. And my daughter loves it, which is awesome, which is even better, the fact that my daughter loves it. Well, I hope you guys were able to enjoy the video. I hope you were able to understand what I was trying to get at with skirt alteration, and I hope that you enjoyed the video. Remember, thumbs up, click the like button, hit the subscribe button, and hit click all notifications so whenever I upload something you can always get the next video. And I'm starting to work on my next videos. I think we're going to go into the Christmas theme since Christmas is just around the corner, and just do some simple things for you guys that you might like for Christmas. And I'll see you in the next video. Bye.